The antiseptic smell of a hospital is supposed to mean healing, but after 48 hours, it just smells like abandonment. I lay there watching the shadows of the Venetian blinds crawl across the linoleum floor, measuring time in the slow drip of an 4 bag. My hip was a dull, throbbing ache, a reminder that gravity eventually claims us all, but my mind was perfectly clear. When the nurse came in for the 3rd time that morning to ask if my daughter, Samantha, had returned my calls, I simply looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 10:14 a.m. Samantha had dropped me off at the emergency room entrance 6 days ago, her engine still idling, her eyes fixed on her smartphone. She told the triage nurse I was a liability she couldn't afford to manage during her promotion week. She didn't stay to see if I could stand. She didn't stay to hear the doctor's name. She left me there with nothing but my handbag and the clothes on my back, convinced that my age had finally rendered me a silent spectator in my own life. It was a calculated move on her part, a belief that a mother's love is a bottomless well that can be poisoned without consequence. But she forgot one thing. I am the one who dug the well. I grew up in a house where silence wasn't an absence of noise. It was a tool for observation. My name is Maggie St. Clair, though names matter less than the work behind them. For 42 years, I ran a commercial cleaning empire that I started with 1 bucket and a secondhand vacuum. I didn't build a life on luck or vibes. I built it on the structural integrity of contracts and the discipline of showing up when others were sleeping. I raised Samantha to understand the value of $1, but I failed to teach her the cost of a soul. I had spent 3 decades funding her private schools, her failed boutique ventures, and her sprawling home in the hills, thinking I was building a legacy. In reality, I was just subsidizing her arrogance. She saw my recent fall as the beginning of her inheritance, a moment where the power dynamic finally shifted in her favor. She thought that by leaving me alone in that hospital bed, she was breaking my spirit. She didn't realize she was actually giving me the one thing I needed most, 6 days of uninterrupted silence to review my ledgers. The betrayal wasn't in the leaving, it was in the tone she used when she finally picked up the phone on day 4. Her voice was light, airy, and entirely devoid of guilt. She told me she had already spoken to a transition specialist about the big house on Oak Street. She talked about my home as if it were a cluttered storage unit that needed emptying. She assumed that because I was physically compromised, my mind had followed suit. She spoke to me with the patronizing lilt one uses for a toddler or a pet. I didn't interrupt her. I let the silence stretch between us, a heavy, cold thing that she tried to fill with nervous chatter about floor plans and estate sales. Silence is a mirror. If you hold it long enough, people eventually show you exactly who they are. Samantha showed me a woman who had mistaken my generosity for a debt I owed her for the privilege of being her mother. She felt entitled to the fruit of a tree she had never watered. By the time the discharge papers were signed on day 6, I wasn't angry. Anger is a leak in the engine. It wastes energy. I was simply cold. I realized that my daughter didn't see a person when she looked at me. She saw a portfolio with a heartbeat. She expected me to call her, sobbing and grateful, when she finally arrived to pick me up, 6 days late and smelling of a celebratory lunch. She expected me to hand over the keys to the Oak Street property because it was just too much for me to handle now. She sat in the hospital parking lot, her sunglasses pushed up on her head, looking at her watch as if my recovery were an inconvenience to her schedule. She thought the game was over. She didn't realize I hadn't even made my opening move. I had spent those 6 days on my laptop, moving pieces she didn't even know existed. You see, the thing about being a liability is that once you're written off, no one notices when you start rewriting the balance sheet. Elderly revenge isn't about shouting. It's about the quiet redistribution of assets. If you want to see how a life of discipline turns the tables on entitled relatives, You need to hear what happened when we pulled into my driveway, and she found the locks had already been changed. This is a story about senior justice, and the moment a mother stops being a bank and starts being a consequence. Does a child owe their parent everything? Or does respect have to be earned every single day? If you've ever felt invisible to the people you sacrificed for, you need to see what comes next. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because the liability starts collecting her debts, and Samantha is about to find out that my silence was the most expensive thing she ever bought. The sound of a car door slamming in a quiet neighborhood has a specific resonance. It's the sound of arrival, of ownership. Samantha stepped out of her white SUV, smoothing her designer slacks, her face already set in that mask of strained patience she wore whenever she had to deal with the elderly. She didn't look at me as she helped me, unnecessarily roughly, out of the passenger seat and toward my front door. She was too busy talking into her Bluetooth headset about marble countertops and modernizing the entryway. She had already moved me out of my home in her mind. She reached for her set of keys, the ones I had given her for emergencies 10 years ago, and slid the silver brass into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. She frowned, jiggling the handle with a sharp, metallic rattle that echoed off the brick porch. She tried again, her movements becoming jerky and frustrated. She didn't realize that while she was busy at her promotion mixer on day 3 of my hospital stay, a locksmith I'd employed for 20 years had already spent 3 hours at my house. I leaned on my walker, watching her struggle. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't apologize for the inconvenience. I simply watched the way her neck flushed a deep, angry red, a physical manifestation of her entitlement being denied. In the world of senior justice, you don't need to raise your voice to make a point. You just need to change the access codes. Samantha turned to me, her eyes narrowing behind her expensive frames, and asked what was wrong with the door. I told her, quite calmly, that the lock wasn't broken. It was simply no longer recognizing her. I let that sentence hang in the air between us like a heavy fog. She laughed, a brittle, condescending sound, and told me I was being dramatic and that brain fog from the pain medication must be setting in. She reached for my handbag, intending to find my set of keys, but I pulled it back with a strength that surprised her. My grandmother used to say that if you give a person enough rope, they'll either build a bridge or a noose. For 30 years, I had provided Samantha with the materials for a bridge. I had funded her education, her down payments, and her ego, believing that maternal support was a foundation for family loyalty. But as I stood on my porch, watching her glare at a door she no longer had the right to open, I realized she had used every inch of that rope to tie herself to a version of me that no longer existed. She saw a grandmother wisdom that was soft and yielding. She didn't see the woman who had negotiated labor contracts with men twice her size in the 70s. She had mistaken my kindness for a lack of boundaries. She thought that because I loved her, I was incapable of seeing her clearly, but silence had sharpened my vision. The betrayal of those 6 days in the hospital wasn't just about the physical neglect. It was the psychological erasure. She had talked to the transition specialist because she assumed I was a commodity to be liquidated. She saw my 4-bedroom home on Oak Street, not as my sanctuary, but as her capital. As she stood on the porch, demanding to know why the locks were changed, she started talking about safety and memory care facilities. She used those soft clinical words that people use when they want to imprison you for your own good. She didn't realize that the liability she had abandoned in the ER was the same woman who held the deed to every luxury she enjoyed. Financial independence is the ultimate shield against entitled relatives, and I had spent 6 days ensuring my shield was polished to a mirror shine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single gleaming gold key. I didn't hand it to her. I held it up so the afternoon sun caught the ridges. I told her that a home is a place for people who show up, not for people who wait for the wake. I watched her expression shift from irritation to genuine shock. She wasn't used to me speaking in structural truths. She was used to me being the sweet Nana who signed the checks and asked no questions. When she tried to step toward me, I simply pointed toward her car. I told her that her things, the few boxes she kept in my attic, were already sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit across town. I handed her a receipt for the first month's rent. After that, the bill would go to her. Quiet power is a slow-acting medicine. It doesn't provide the instant gratification of a shouting match, but it ensures that the message is received deep in the marrow. Samantha stood there, the receipt fluttering in her hand, realizing for the first time that the locks hadn't just changed on the house, they had changed on our entire relationship. She had played a hand she didn't actually hold, assuming my hand was empty. She didn't know I was holding the entire deck. The look of dawning realization on her face was more satisfying than any apology she could have concocted. She realized then that the liability had just foreclosed on her future. Setting boundaries with family isn't about cruelty. It's about the restoration of order. I watched her drive away, her tires screeching just a little too loudly, a final tantrum of the truly defeated. I walked into my house, the air smelling of lemon wax and peace, and I locked the door behind me. I had a lot of work to do. There were accounts to close, wills to revise, and a very specific letter to write to her boss at the firm. If she wanted to treat our relationship like a business transaction, I was more than happy to show her how a professional handle a breach of contract. The silence of my study at midnight is a different kind of quiet than the hospital. It is the silence of a command center. I sat at my mahogany desk, the one Samantha always said was too masculine for the room, and spread out the bank statements like a general mapping a battlefield. For years, I had ignored the small discrepancies. I had looked away when $50 here or $100 there vanished from the joint account I had set up for household emergencies. I had told myself it was the price of a peaceful life, a small tax on my daughter's happiness. But as I sat there with a magnifying glass and a pot of black tea, the numbers stopped being family history and started being evidence. Samantha hadn't just neglected me in a hospital bed. She had been systematically harvesting my life while I was still breathing. I found the first emergency withdrawal from 3 months ago. It wasn't for a plumbing leak or a roof repair. The merchant code traced back to a high-end medical spa in the city. While I was at home struggling with the early tremors of the hip pain that would eventually drop me, my daughter was using my retirement savings to buy her youth back in Botox and fillers. She had looked me in the eye at Sunday dinner and complained about the rising cost of my prescriptions, all while the ghost of my money was settled under her skin. Grandmother wisdom is often mistaken for being out of touch, but the truth is we just see through the performance. I realized then that her promotion week wasn't just a career milestone, it was a deadline. She needed me out of the house so she could finish what she started. In the world of family betrayal, there is a specific type of overconfidence that comes from assuming an elder has lost their edge. Samantha thought I didn't know how to navigate a digital ledger. She thought my iPad was only for playing bridge and looking at photos of my hibiscus plants. She didn't know that I had spent my 6 days in the hospital recovery wing relearning the back end of my diversified portfolio. I sat in that study for 5 hours, tracing the flow of capital. It was a structural failure of character. She had been skimming the cream off my labor for years, convinced that I was too sweet to ever audit the woman I had birthed. But when you call your mother a liability, you waive the right to her grace. You become a vendor. And I have always been very strict with my vendors. I watched the clock tick toward 3 a.m. In the quiet, I could almost hear the house breathing. This home was more than bricks. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of 4 a.m. wake-up calls and bleach-stained hands. To Samantha, it was a payday. To me, it was a fortress. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade, my old corporate attorney, a man who understood that family is a beautiful sentiment, but a contract is a reality. I didn't cry. I didn't vent. I simply asked him to pull the filings for the boutique I had co-signed for her 5 years ago. I wanted to see exactly how much of my name she was still using to prop up her failing ambitions. The revelation was chilling. She hadn't just used my cash. She had used my credit score as a scaffold for a mountain of debt I never authorized. She assumed I would never check, or that if I did, I would be too ashamed to speak up. That is the greatest mistake entitled relatives make. They count on your shame to protect their crimes. They think the toxic label they fear will keep you silent. But I don't care about labels. I care about structure. By dawn, I had a digital folder ready to be sent. It contained every spa day, every emergency that wasn't, and every unauthorized signature. I felt a strange sense of peace. It was the same feeling I used to get after a long night of scrubbing a floor until the tile shone. The dirt was gone. The truth remained. Satisfying revenge isn't about the fire. It's about the frost. It's about the moment the person who exploited you realizes the tap has run dry and the bill is past due. I sent a single email to Samantha's personal account at 6 a.m. No subject line, just an attachment of the spa withdrawal and the word audit. I didn't need to say more. I knew she was awake, probably checking her phone between sips of an expensive latte, planning which room of my house she would turn into her home office. I wanted her to feel that first cold shiver of consequence. I wanted her to know that the liability was now the auditor. Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no. It's about removing the tools of the trespasser. I had spent a lifetime building a legacy, and I would be damned if I let it be dismantled by a woman who couldn't even stay for a 30-minute discharge. Silence was doing the heavy lifting now. Every minute she spent staring at that email, without a response from me, was a minute she spent realizing her world was built on sand. She had underestimated the woman who built the empire. And that is a mistake you only get to make once. The corporate world has a very specific way of dealing with image. Samantha's firm, a high-gloss architectural consulting group, prided itself on the concept of generational integrity. Their brochures were filled with photos of smiling families and the promise of building legacies that last. It was the perfect stage for a woman who performed the role of the devoted, high-achieving daughter, while her mother sat in a hospital bed under a different name because she hadn't bothered to check the intake forms. I sat in my garden the following Tuesday, the sun warming my shoulders, watching a hummingbird hover over the jasmine. In my hand was my tablet, logged into the live stream of the Mid-Year Excellence Awards at Samantha's firm. She had told me months ago that this was the day her promotion to senior partner would be made official. She had even asked if she could borrow my vintage Chanel pearls for the occasion. I had given them to her. She was wearing them now, glowing under the stage lights, a picture of poise and success. She didn't know that the audit email I had sent her wasn't the end of the paper trail. It was just the first domino. While she was getting her hair done for the ceremony, I had been on a conference call with her firm's compliance officer. You see, when you use a co-signer's credit and name to secure business loans under false pretenses, it isn't just a family spat, it's a regulatory issue. I didn't call to complain about her leaving me in the hospital. That would be emotional, and emotions are messy. I called to formally rescind my financial backing and to report irregularities in the documentation she had submitted for her boutique's bridge loan, which she had conveniently listed as a subsidiary of my own holding company. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a woman discussing the weather. I didn't want her fired. I wanted her exposed. The betrayal of a child is a unique weight, but the betrayal of a partner in business is a legal liability. As I watched the screen, the CEO of the firm stood up to announce the new partners. Samantha leaned forward, her smile practiced and bright, but the CEO didn't say her name. He paused, looked down at a folder on the podium, the folder I had couriered over that morning, and cleared his throat. He announced 2 other names, then abruptly ended the segment. The camera caught Samantha's face for a split second. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The confused look she threw toward the wings of the stage was the look of someone who had just realized the floor they were standing on was actually a trapdoor. I took a slow sip of my tea. Silence is a powerful conductor of fear. I knew exactly what was happening in the wings of that ballroom. I knew the HR director was waiting for her. I knew they were asking her why a senior partner candidate had a mother who was currently filing a formal affidavit regarding identity theft and unauthorized withdrawals. I hadn't used the word revenge once in my communications. I used words like fiduciary responsibility and ethical oversight. Karma is often just the bill for your own actions finally arriving at the correct address. Samantha had spent years treating me like a silent ATM, assuming the grandmother wisdom I offered was a sign of a softening mind. She forgot that I didn't build a cleaning empire by missing the dirt in the corners. The consequence was structural. By 2 p.m., my phone began to vibrate incessantly. Samantha's name flashed on the screen over and over. I didn't answer. I let the silence do the work. I let her sit in the wreckage of her promotion week, realizing that the pearls around her neck were the only thing of mine she had left. She had traded her mother's safety for a chance at a title, and in the end, she had lost both. She had called me a liability, but as it turned out, I was the only asset she ever truly had. Standing up for yourself doesn't require a scene. It requires a signature in the right place at the right time. I watched the hummingbird fly away, leaving the garden in perfect stillness. I felt lighter than I had in years. The house on Oak Street was quiet, the locks were secure, and the truth was finally out in the open. But the audit wasn't finished. There was still the matter of the transition specialist she had hired to sell my home, and the surprise I had waiting for them when they showed up for the scheduled walkthrough the next morning. There is a specific kind of arrogance that belongs to the young and the greedy. It is the belief that a lock is just a suggestion, and a contract is just a piece of paper. At 9 a.m. on Wednesday, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man in a tailored suit carrying a leather portfolio. The transition specialist Samantha had hired to liquidate my life while I was still recovering from a broken hip. He didn't knock. He walked straight to the front door and reached for the handle with the practiced ease of a man who had already mentally spent his commission. He didn't know I was sitting just 6 feet away on the other side of the heavy oak door, listening to the chime of his frustration as he realized his universal key code no longer worked. I waited. I let the silence do its work for exactly 3 minutes. I wanted him to feel the heat of the morning sun and the cold weight of a closed door. When I finally opened it, I didn't use a walker. I stood tall, leaning slightly on a silver-headed cane that had belonged to my father. The man, a Mr. Howard, started to give me a rehearsed smile, the kind people use when they're talking to someone they've already decided is incompetent. He began his pitch about downsizing for dignity and maximizing the estate's value. He spoke as if I weren't there, or perhaps as if I were already a ghost haunting my own hallways. He mentioned that Samantha had given him full discretionary authority to begin the appraisal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell him to leave. I simply handed him a single sheet of paper, the updated deed to the house. I had spent my 5th day in the hospital moving the property into a private irrevocable trust. Samantha was no longer a beneficiary. In fact, her name had been scrubbed from the legal lineage of the Oak Street house entirely. Mr. Howard's smile faltered as he scanned the document. He was a professional. He knew a structural dead end when he saw one. He looked at me, then at the paper, then back at me. He realized in that moment that Samantha had sold him a bridge she didn't own. She had taken a retainer from him based on the lie that I was incapacitated and that she was my legal guardian. The betrayal of a child often comes with a paper trail of smaller lies. As I stood there, I told Mr. Howard that if he wanted to discuss the property, he could contact my legal team, but that any further trespassing would result in a call to the authorities. I also mentioned quite casually that I was aware of the kickback agreement he had signed with Samantha, a 20% cut of the sale price delivered under the table to her boutique's account. His face went gray. Senior justice isn't just about protecting your own assets. It's about exposing the rot in the people who try to take them. He didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, got back into his sedan, and drove away so fast he clipped the edge of my manicured lawn. Quiet power is the ability to end a conversation before it even begins. I went back inside and sat in my favorite armchair. The house felt larger now, cleaner. I realized that for years I had been living in a space crowded by the expectations of a daughter who only saw me as a hurdle between her and her inheritance. She had treated me like a liability because she was terrified of my strength. She knew that if I ever stopped being the mother and started being the founder, her lifestyle would collapse like a house of cards. And that is exactly what was happening. By noon, the transition was complete, but not the one Samantha had planned. I had transitioned her out of my finances, my home, and my future. But there was one more piece of the puzzle. I had discovered a secret during my audit, a series of payments Samantha had been making to a private investigator 3 years ago. She hadn't been looking for a business rival. She had been looking for the father she thought I had buried decades ago. And she had found him. The past is never truly buried. It is simply waiting for someone with enough greed to go digging. As I sat in the quiet of my study, the file the private investigator had sent to Samantha lay open on my desk. She had spent $12,000 of my money to find a man I had spent 40 years trying to forget. His name was Raymond St. Clair. To the world, he was a charming, silver-tongued entrepreneur who had vanished when Samantha was a toddler. To me, he was the man who had nearly hollowed out my soul before I found the strength to walk away with nothing but a toddler and a cleaning bucket. Samantha had spent her life romanticizing the lost father, convinced that her refinement came from his mysterious bloodline rather than my calloused hands. She had finally tracked him down to a coastal town in Florida, and the letters she had written him were filled with the same poison she had recently directed at me. She called me stifling. She called me controlling. She told him she was ready to reclaim her true heritage. I looked at the photograph of Raymond included in the file. He was still handsome in that hollow, predatory way. He looked like a man who had never done a day's labor in his life, a man who survived on the luster of other people's dreams. Samantha thought she was finding a savior, someone who would validate her sense of superiority and help her manage the burden of her aging mother. She didn't realize that Raymond was a mirror of her own worst impulses. She saw a father, I saw a predator, who had found a new, younger Mark. My daughter, in her haste to discard me, had invited a wolf to the table and told him where I kept the silver. Betrayal has a way of coming full circle. I realized that the reason Samantha needed my house liquidated so quickly wasn't just for her boutique's debts. She had promised Raymond a consulting fee to help him launch a new venture. She was being swindled by the very ghost she had summoned. It would have been easy to let it happen. It would have been a poetic kind of senior justice to watch her lose everything to the man she chose over me. But that is the difference between a mother and a predator. Even now, With my hip aching and the memory of those 6 days in the hospital burning in my mind, I couldn't let her destroy the St. Clair name by handing it to a con artist. I picked up the phone and made a call to the Florida town where Raymond was hiding. I didn't call him. I called the local sheriff, a man I had known back when we were both starting our careers. I asked him for a wellness check on a specific address, and I asked him to pull the public records for any recent litigation involving a Mr. Raymond St. Clair. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. Raymond wasn't a successful businessman. He was a man living on the edge of a dozen different indictments. Samantha hadn't found her heritage. She had found a sinking ship, and she was currently tying her life raft to it. Quiet power is often the act of letting someone see the cliff before they jump. I didn't send Samantha another email. I didn't call her to warn her. I simply waited for the inevitable. I knew she would come to me eventually, not out of love, but out of necessity. She had spent her life underestimating my intelligence, but she was about to learn that a grandmother's wisdom isn't just about baking cookies and telling stories. It's about knowing exactly where the bodies are buried because she was the one who had to dig the graves. The next morning, the silence of my home was broken by the sound of a key scratching at the lock, the new lock. I stood in the hallway, watching the shadow of my daughter through the frosted glass. She wasn't pounding on the door this time. She was leaning against it, her head down, her designer suit wrinkled. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that the world outside my protection was much colder than she had anticipated. She didn't know I knew about Raymond. She didn't know I had already seen the investment contracts she had signed. She thought she still had a secret. The shadow against the frosted glass remained still for a long time before she finally knocked. It wasn't the sharp, demanding rap of a woman who owned the world. It was a hesitant, rhythmic thud that sounded like a heartbeat. I opened the door and stepped back, letting the silence of the foyer draw her in. Samantha looked diminished. The Chanel pearls I had lent her, the ones she wore to the promotion that never happened, were tucked under the collar of a trench coat, as if she were trying to hide the very status she had craved. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor, at the polished wood she used to run across as a child. I led her into the parlor, the room where I keep the portraits of the women who came before me. They were all there. My mother who washed laundry until her knuckles bled. My grandmother who bought her own freedom. And me. I sat in my high-back chair and gestured for her to take the sofa. For 5 minutes, I said nothing. I watched her struggle with the quiet. Silence is a heavy garment for someone with a guilty conscience. She began to speak, her voice a fragile thread, trying to explain the misunderstanding at the firm. She talked about stress and burnout. She even tried to bring up the hospital, claiming she had called the nurses every hour. A lie so transparent it didn't even merit a rebuttal. I simply reached into the side table and pulled out the Florida file. I placed it on the coffee table between us. The name Raymond St. Clair was visible in bold, black ink. The color drained from her face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. The betrayal was no longer a one-way street. She realized that while she was busy trying to liquidate my life, I had been documenting the resurrection of her father. I told her, with a voice as steady as a heartbeat, that I knew about the consulting fees. I knew about the bank transfers she had made from her boutique account, the account that was still technically tied to my holding company's credit line. She had been feeding my hard-earned legacy to a man who had abandoned her before she could even say his name. She started to cry then, but it wasn't the cry of a daughter seeking comfort. It was the cry of a gambler who had realized the house knew she was cheating. Grandmother wisdom is often about knowing when to stop protecting someone from their own choices. I told her that Raymond hadn't spent that investment on a new venture. He had spent it on a series of back taxes and a settlement for a fraud case in the Keys. I showed her the report from the Florida sheriff. She had been so desperate for a father who looked like the success she wanted to be that she had ignored the stench of the con. She had called me a liability because I represented the reality of work, of age, and of truth. Raymond represented the fantasy of easy wealth, the same fantasy that had led her to leave me in that hospital bed. I didn't offer her a tissue. I didn't move to hug her. I told her that the boutique would be filing for bankruptcy by the end of the week. I had already withdrawn my corporate guarantee. The structural consequences of her choices were now manifest. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp flare of the old arrogance, asking how I could be so cold to my own flesh and blood. I told her that being a mother means providing a foundation, but it does not mean providing a floor for someone who insists on digging a pit. I was not being cold. I was being precise. The parlor felt smaller than the weight of the generations looking down on us. I told her she could stay in her house for 30 days while she figured out her next move, but the Oak Street property was now part of a trust that would eventually become a community center for elderly women. She was no longer an heiress. She was an adult with a debt to society and a mother who had finally stopped paying the interest on her mistakes. She sat there in the silence, the realization of her new reality finally settling in. She had lost the promotion, the boutique, and the father she had tried to buy. All she had left was the mother she had tried to discard. Setting boundaries isn't a temporary state. It is a permanent renovation of the soul. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. I had a dinner to prepare. A meal for one, seasoned with the peace of a woman who no longer has to look over her shoulder. As she walked toward the door, I reminded her that the Chanel pearls belonged back in my jewelry box before she left. They were earned with 40 years of discipline, and they were no longer hers to wear. The following evening, the silence I had cultivated was interrupted by a sound I hadn't heard in 40 years, the rhythmic, heavy bass of a rental car idling at my curb. I stood at my bedroom window, pulling back the sheer curtain just enough to see. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He adjusted his linen blazer and smoothed back his silver hair with a gesture so familiar it made my hip ache with a phantom memory. Raymond St. Clair had arrived. He didn't look like a man fleeing indictments. He looked like a man arriving to collect a prize. He walked up my driveway with the predatory grace of someone who had spent his life convincing women that his presence was a gift they couldn't afford to lose. He didn't know that the woman inside this house was no longer the 24-year-old girl who had once believed his lies were gospel. I didn't wait for him to knock. I met him on the porch, the golden glow of the sunset casting long, sharp shadows across the brick. He froze when he saw me. He had expected Samantha to be the one to greet him. Samantha, his new partner, his ticket back into the life of the landed gentry. Instead, he found the liability. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer my hand. I simply stood there, my cane planted firmly on the ground, a physical barrier between him and the house I had bled to keep. He tried to summon that old honeyed charm. He called me by my first name, his voice a low, gravelly vibrato that had once made me feel small. He told me he was here to reunite the family and to help Samantha through her recent difficulties. Silence is the only proper response to a performer who has lost his audience. I let him speak for 3 minutes. I let him weave a story of redemption and missed opportunities. I let him mention the investments Samantha had made, framing them as a shared future for all of us. When he finally ran out of breath, I leaned forward. I told him that the bank account he had been draining for the last 6 months had been frozen 4 hours ago. I told him that the consulting fees he had already spent were being flagged as fraudulent transfers in a bankruptcy court. His eyes, once bright with simulated warmth, turned cold and flat. The predator finally realized the trap had already sprung. Senior justice is often about the timing of the reveal. I told Raymond that the sheriff in Florida was expecting a call from me by 9 p.m. to confirm whether he was still in the state. I watched the charm evaporate, replaced by a desperate, twitching irritation. He wasn't a wolf. He was a stray dog who had grown old and toothless, still trying to growl at the hand that held the leash. He looked past me toward the house, perhaps hoping to see Samantha, his last remaining leverage. But Samantha was inside, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, finally seeing the man she had traded her mother for. She was watching her true heritage barter for a way out of a police report. I told him he had 10 minutes to get back into his rental car and leave my neighborhood. I told him that if he ever contacted my daughter again, I would move from civil litigation to criminal prosecution. I spoke with the calm of a woman who has nothing left to fear because she has already survived the worst thing he could do to her. Raymond didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply spat on the ground near my feet, a small, pathetic gesture of a defeated man, and walked back to his car. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner, leaving the street in a silence so profound it felt like a benediction. I turned back to the house. Samantha was standing in the foyer, her face streaked with tears, her body shaking. She had heard every word. She had seen the man she romanticized crumble at the first sign of a real consequence. She had seen that the stifling mother she wanted to escape was the only thing standing between her and a man who would have picked her bones clean. But I didn't move to comfort her. The lesson wasn't over. You don't get to burn the house down and then expect the person who built it to provide you with a blanket. Quiet power means knowing when the work is done. I walked past her without a word and headed to the kitchen to make a pot of tea. The structural integrity of our relationship had been destroyed, and while I would not let her starve, I would no longer allow her to feast on my peace. She had to learn to build something of her own, on her own, without the liability of my bank account to soften the fall. The silence in the house was no longer a weight. It was a boundary. There is a specific kind of labor that leaves a soul feeling clean, and it usually involves removing the clutter that no longer serves a purpose. On Monday morning, I didn't wake up to the sound of Samantha's complaints or the ping of a bank notification. I woke up to the sound of a heavy-duty shredder. I spent the morning in my study, feeding years of co-signed agreements, paid-off boutique invoices, and emergency loan documents into the teeth of the machine. Each pass of the blades was a structural divorce. I wasn't just destroying paper. I was dismantling the mechanism that allowed my daughter to remain a child well into her 30s. When the shredder bin was full, I felt a lightness in my chest that no hospital medication could ever provide. Samantha was in the guest room, the only space in the house I hadn't yet reclaimed. She emerged around noon, her eyes puffy, her pride finally replaced by a dawning sense of survival. She asked me, in a voice that lacked its usual sharp edge, what she was supposed to do now that the boutique was shuttered and the firm had accepted her resignation. I didn't look up from my ledger. I told her that the local community college was hiring administrative assistants and that the bus line ran every 30 minutes from the corner of Oak Street. I saw the flash of horror in her eyes. The idea of public transit and a clerical salary was, to her, a fate worse than the betrayal she had committed. But grandmother wisdom knows that the only way to appreciate the view is to understand the climb. Setting boundaries with an entitled relative is a form of surgery. You have to cut away the rot so the healthy tissue can breathe. I informed her that her 30 days in my house would be spent earning her keep. There would be no more administrative fees or allowances. If she wanted to eat from my pantry, she would help maintain the garden that she had once called a waste of prime real estate. I watched her hands that had only ever held designer bags and cocktail glasses, as she touched the soil for the first time in years. She looked at the dirt under her fingernails as if it were a disease. I looked at it and saw the beginning of a cure. While she worked in the garden under my silent supervision, I began the real work of vintage vengeance. I contacted the board of the local women's shelter. I told them I was ready to finalize the trust. This house, with its crown molding and its history of sacrifice, would no longer be a monument to one family's greed. It would become a transition house for elderly women who, like me, had been discarded by those who should have protected them. I was turning my sanctuary into a fortress for the liabilities of the world. The look on the board director's face when I showed her the deed was worth more than any promotion Samantha could have ever achieved. It was a moment of senior justice that felt like a long, cool drink of water. The silence between Samantha and me during those days was different. It wasn't the cold silence of the hospital or the panicked silence of the parlor. It was the silence of a construction site. Something was being built. Even if it was just the realization that the world does not owe you a living based on your mother's sweat. I watched her from the kitchen window as she struggled with the pruning shears. She was learning that things don't just stay beautiful on their own. They require attention, discipline, and respect for the roots. She was finally beginning to understand that I wasn't a bank. I was the gardener who had been keeping her alive. Satisfying revenge isn't about seeing someone fail. It's about seeing them finally forced to be honest. Samantha was no longer the senior partner or the boutique owner. She was a woman with a bus pass and a pair of dirty gloves. For the first time in her life, she was grounded in reality. She had tried to sell my home to fund a fantasy, and now she was tending that same earth just to earn a seat at the table. It was a quiet, powerful redistribution of truth. The final day arrived with a sunrise that felt like a fresh page. The movers had already taken my personal belongings, the few pieces of furniture that held my history, to the small, elegant apartment I had secured overlooking the city. The Oak Street house was now an empty vessel, waiting to be filled with the voices of women who had been told they were past their prime. I stood in the center of the foyer, the same spot where Samantha had once stood dreaming of marble upgrades and estate sales. Today, the air didn't smell of bleach or betrayal. It smelled of possibility. I held a heavy ring of keys in my hand, each one a symbol of the structural justice I had spent the last month engineering. Samantha stood by the front door, her single suitcase at her feet. She looked different. The polished, artificial sheen of the senior partner had been replaced by a weary, human stillness. She had spent 30 days working the soil and riding the bus, and while the anger still flickered in her eyes occasionally, it was dampened by the sheer weight of reality. She looked at the empty house, and then at me. She asked me, one last time, why I couldn't just forgive her and let things go back to the way they were. She still didn't understand that the way things were was a house built on a fault line. I told her that forgiveness is a private matter, but trust is a public record. And her record was in arrears. Grandmother wisdom isn't about being a martyr. It's about being a lighthouse. I didn't give her a lecture on her character. I gave her a small, white envelope. Inside was not a check, but a receipt for the first year of tuition at a vocational school for paralegal studies, paid in full. I told her that if she wanted to be a partner, she would have to learn the law from the ground up, with her own brain and her own sweat. I was no longer funding her lifestyle, but I would always fund a path to integrity. She took the envelope with trembling hands, realizing that the liability had given her the only thing she actually needed, a way to earn her own dignity. At 10 a.m., the board members of the New Beginnings Trust arrived. They were women like me, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed by noise. As I handed over the keys to the Oak Street property, I felt the final chord of the past snap. This house was no longer a target for entitled relatives. It was a sanctuary for senior justice. I watched as the first new resident, a a woman who had been displaced by her own son's gambling debts, walked across the threshold. She touched the mahogany banister with a reverence that Samantha had never shown. In that moment, the liability of my age was transformed into the legend of my legacy. I walked down the front steps for the last time, not as a victim of family betrayal, but as the architect of my own peace. I didn't look back at the house, and I didn't look back at the daughter who was still standing on the sidewalk, clutching her future in a white envelope. I got into my car and drove toward the city. The silence in the car was beautiful. It was the silence of a woman who had spent 70 years building a life and 6 days in a hospital bed, realizing that the only person who can truly reclaim your dignity is you. Setting boundaries isn't a wall, it's a gate. It keeps the predators out and lets the worthy in. I am Maggie St. Clair, and I am not a liability. I am a consequence. My life is no longer a bank for the entitled. It is a masterclass in quiet power. If you've spent your life being the ladder for people who won't even hold your hand when you fall, it's time to stop climbing for them and start building for yourself. Karma doesn't always come with a shout. Sometimes it just comes with a change of locks. Are you tired of being the silent funder of someone else's disrespect? It's time to turn your wisdom into a strategic plan for justice. If this story of reclaiming dignity moved you, share it with one person who needs to know that elderly is not a synonym for easy target. Subscribe to Vintage Vengeance today to ensure you never miss a lesson in setting boundaries and delivering the kind of quiet power that changes lives. Your legacy is yours to protect. Don't wait for a hospital bed to start rewriting your story.